Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Taquitos de Sesos for the month of October. I'm very glad that you could join us as we're closing off the series of Women in Academic Medicine. Today we have Dr. Kubu from Cleveland Clinic presenting on Women in Leadership, Untangling the Double Bind. We're lucky to have her. She has put out some very nice articles on leadership and women, and works with the WIN group in the past, and has done a lot of wonderful things to help encourage women to understand how leadership roles can work and how those can differ when it's a leadership position for a woman versus a man, some of the obstacles that women face in academic medicine. And she has also a special curriculum that she has put together at the Cleveland Clinic. So thank you very much, Dr. Kubu, for joining us. I know you've had a very busy schedule this past few months, and I really appreciate you coming on board. Folks, you will be muted now for the recording. If you have any questions, Dr. Kubu can take questions via the chat on Zoom, or hopefully we will have a few minutes at the very end of her presentation. Thank you very much. The time is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing here as well. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my soul. In fact, when I think about how I want to carve out my professional time, it's faculty development, particularly for women and underrepresented minorities, and then my research is in neuroethics. But what I want to focus on today is Women in Leadership, Untangling the Double Bind, and this was essentially based off of a paper that I was invited to write for a special volume of the Clinical Neuropsychologist that came out in 2018. And the title of the paper I wrote was, Who Does She Think She Is? Women, Leadership, and the B word. So we'll move forward with some of that. I have no disclosures regarding this presentation. And my broad goals, and I want to preface all of this by saying that I am not an expert in this area. There are people who I will be citing who are experts in this area, but I do read this literature, and I think that it's important to try and figure out some of what's going on to help make sense out of our own experiences. So the goals for today, we're going to touch on social role theory. We're going to look at the interaction between gender role expectations and organizational citizenship behavior. We're going to discuss different models of leadership. Then we'll get into women in leadership. We'll touch the B word. And then really, because I'm somebody that really wants to make actions and move things forward, we're going to start talking about what can we do to develop a leadership identity and how do we move forward and concrete steps to do so. So if we look at the current state, we know that if we look at S&P Fortune 500 companies, what we see is that although women account for almost 45% of the total employees, they represent only 5.2% of the CEOs. So there are these big discrepancies in terms of women in the workforce and those who are, and how we're represented in leadership. This is despite the fact that we know that increased diversity results in increased profits and return on investment. So it doesn't make business sense whatsoever. When we look in terms of the academic medical data, we're looking at the AAMC data by gender and rank. And we know here that approximately 40% of women of faculty in academic medicine are women. Despite this, what we can see is clear discrepancies at those higher academic ranks, where about 22% of all professors are women and the majority are men. And we see this discrepancy as well at the associate professor level, and it evens out a bit more at the assistant professor level. This is not a pipeline issue. Women have been granted medical degrees for over a century, and they are in academic medicine. So this is not a pipeline issue. We also know that only 16% of medical schools deans are women. If we look more specifically at the field of neuropsychology in terms of gender, and these are data from a paper written by Sweet and the same volume of TCM that I cited from 2018. And what we see here is that, once again, women, well, first of all, just back up for a second here. In 1989, 73% of neuropsychologists were men. And more than 25, or about 25 years later, it's primarily women, and 56% of neuropsychologists are women. In 2015, 76.6% of postdoctoral trainees in neuropsychology were women. So we're seeing more and more women come into the field, but despite this, we still have these gender gaps when you're looking at leadership positions. Once again, looking at that professor level rank, we see that roughly about 22% of professors in neuropsychology are women. Approximately 42% are associate professors, and over 60% are at the assistant professor level. We look at kind of roles, institutional roles, and gender in neuropsychology. There are more women who indicate that their role is staff than men. Clinical program director, more men are the clinical program director than women. Research program director, more men than women. Clinical training director is the only role in which there are more women than men. And we're going to touch on this in a bit. Division head, we see these same trends. Department chair, and then other, which I'm not quite sure what that referred to. So we're seeing that there is a dearth of women in leadership positions, both in the business sector, in academic medicine, and in the neuropsychology field. Why? Well, my goal today is just to provide some general scaffolding, our ideas or frameworks, so we can start to make sense out of this. And once again, just to summarize some of my understanding of the relevant literatures so that we can start to figure out what we need to do, why this is happening, and then what we need to do to change it. The first thing I want to touch on is social role theory, particularly gender and leadership. Leaders elicit a set of expectancies based on people's characterizations of them as men or women. And these expectancies can be construed as gender roles, which are the shared beliefs that apply to individuals on the basis of their socially identified sex. There are two aspects of gender roles that are important in leadership, and that is agentic and communal. Agentic attributes refer to things such as assertive, controlling, confident, and they're typically ascribed to men. And the actions associated with that include speaking out, influencing others, initiating action to complete tasks, problem-focused actions, and innovation, which tends to be viewed as a combination of self-confidence and daring. In contrast, communal attributes are focused on concern with the welfare of others, kindness, empathy, nurturing, interpersonal sensitivity, and most often ascribed to women. Where the focus and the actions associated with that is to focus attention on the group rather than oneself. There's more tentative speech. It's important to support others and to address relational or interpersonal problems over direct problem solving. No good deed goes unpunished. What do I mean about that? Well, there's this concept in organizational behavior psychology, and it's called organizational citizenship behavior. It's a type of social exchange behavior based on quid pro quo, which at this point has a very different connotation than it did when I wrote this talk a while ago. So organizational citizenship behavior refers to actions that support the social and psychological work environment. It includes things such as helping others, socializing new employees, volunteer work, showing somebody where the cafeteria is, taking your time out to give them a tour of the campus as they're new on staff. But these are discretionary behaviors, which is important, and they're not directly or explicitly recognized by the formal reward system. It's something you do to be a good citizen, but in the aggregate, they promote the efficient and effective functioning of the organization. So how does organizational citizenship behavior interface with gender? Well, women are expected to engage in more organizational citizenship behaviors than men. These behaviors are typically time-intensive, and their cost with increasing organizational citizenship behaviors, like job creep to other aspects of your life, job stress, work, family conflict, and so on. Furthermore, women are punished or penalized if they do not conform to these expectations. And women don't benefit from engaging in these kinds of behaviors anywhere near the extent to which men do, because it's expected of women to be helpful and kind and provide these supportive roles, when men do it, it's a huge bump to them, whereas if women don't, they're penalized. These behaviors contrast with task behaviors, which are fundamental to an organization's mission and typically include what you see on a job application. And these organizational citizenship behaviors come at the cost of task behaviors, but task behaviors are highly associated with compensation, career advancement, and promotion, and those things that propel you up in leadership positions in an organization. Bergeron in 2012 demonstrated a longitudinal study on communal organizational citizenship behavior in academic institutions that women engaged in more of these behaviors than men, that over the course of their career, women's engagement in these behaviors increased even more, and that women had lower career outcomes. So, women are running and running and running and running and running, trying to advance their own careers, manage family and work responsibilities, and then doing all of this extra volunteer work, organizational citizenship behavior, because it's expected of them. And while we're engaging all of this, through no fault of their own, many men are leapfrogging over women into leadership positions. Why in the world would we do that? It's because we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. The cost of saying no outweigh the benefits. Women need to engage in even more of this organizational citizenship behavior to reap the same benefits men receive. And Bergeron argues that women's disadvantaged role in the workplace vis-a-vis the factors I've listed here, lower salaries, less powerful positions, often undervalued, success attributed to luck, reduced social networks, requires even more work to get the benefits, and then you have to engage in more of this organizational citizenship behavior, which creates this endless spiral. Okay, how about leadership, specifically leadership and gender? Since about the 1980s, leadership literature has been dominated by Byrne's model, in which there are two different aspects of leadership that he identified. Transactional leadership is what we think of when we think of a stereotypical leader. It supports the status quo. You give me something, I give you something in return. It's an exchange of something of value. And transactional leaders focus on time, efficiency, and minimizing risk. So transactional, it's a transaction, supports the status quo, and they focus on time, efficiency, and reducing risk. In contrast, you have transformational leaders like Malala, who model a set of values that leads everyone to go beyond their own needs for the sake of the team. Transformational leaders articulate a clear vision for the future, intellectually stimulate subordinates, pay close attention to individual differences, sees opportunities and challenges or risks, and is not risk averse necessarily, and prefers effective to efficient answers and challenges the status quo. Further, some argue that transformational leaders engage others to raise everyone to a higher level of motivation or morality. Now, transformational leadership is associated with a number of positive organizational outcome metrics, yet transactional leadership can also be effective, and it's best to view the two styles as complementary and not orthogonal, so they're not pitted against each other, because in certain points in time or with certain tasks or whatever is facing the organization, one leadership style may be more beneficial than the other. And it depends on the context and the demands, and they often complement each other. And the most effective leaders utilize both of those styles. What about gender and leadership styles? There are a number of meta-analyses that have been done, most often by Eagley here. And what they looked at is they looked at studies that looked at task-oriented versus interpersonal style in terms of gender. Both men and women were equal in terms of their task-oriented style to leadership. There was a slight increase in the number in the studies that indicate that women used more of an interpersonal style in leadership than men. And when they looked at autocratic versus democratic leadership styles, they found that men tended to be much more autocratic and directive than women, and women were more participative and democratic in their leadership styles. What was important, I think is critically important here, is that when you do a deeper dive into these data, and they looked at the social context of where the experiment took place, and there were three broad categories in which these experiments took place: laboratory experiments, assessment studies of people not selected for leadership roles, and then organizational studies that compared leadership styles in men and women in the same occupational role. The gender differences persisted in the laboratory and assessment studies, but there were no differences in interpersonal or task style in the organizational studies. So no gender differences in people actually in leadership roles. Nonetheless, the significant differences in a democratic style persisted regardless of this context. Another meta-analysis looked at gender and transformational, transactional, and kind of this laissez-faire leadership style where you just kind of throw up your hands and let anything go. There was a very slight indication that women tended to use a transformational leadership style more than men, which is intuitively reasonable given gender differences and communal versus agentic styles. So you might expect that women leaders might have a slight advantage with respect to organizational outcomes, but several studies have failed to demonstrate gender differences with respect to leadership effectiveness. Another meta-analysis looked at 99 studies with approximately 95 samples. Once again, leadership effectiveness was equal for women and men when all leadership contexts were considered. There were some moderating variables that were significant. The more masculine or male-dominant an organization showed a significant advantage for male leaders' effectiveness. And there was also a significant effect for the source of the rating. So that women, if you were looking others' ratings of their leadership style, tended to be rated higher when it was the other ratings versus men. Whereas if you looked at, I'm rating my own leadership, men tended to rate themselves more highly than women did. Finally, and I think this is something that we need to tease out a little bit more, they looked at the era of the study, and this was non-significant, but the effect size data suggested that men were perceived as more effective leaders in older era studies, whereas women were more effective in more recent studies. So it may be that it's changing over time, albeit slowly. So bottom line, when you look at the leadership literature with respect to gender, what we know, and I think this is critically important, is good and effective leaders are simply good and effective leaders, regardless of gender. So if the data indicate that women are just as effective leaders as men, then why aren't there more women in leadership positions? And this is where gender roles and leadership intersect. Because women also function in their leadership roles within the expectations of their gender role. And gender role expectations exist in organizations and provide an implicit background identity. These gender role expectations are shared by subordinates, peers, leaders, and are often internalized. There's often a blending of organizational expectations for appropriate leadership behaviors and gender role expectations. It gets to be problematic when gender role expectations are discordant from leadership role expectations. And this, according to Igley and Kubu, results in two forms of prejudice against women. One, there's less favorable evaluations of women's leadership potential compared to men, because agentic or leadership behavior is viewed as more stereotypic of men than women. And since it's a woman applying, she's not going to be viewed as favorably because she doesn't have those agentic characteristics. And a less favorable evaluation of women in actual leadership roles and their actual leadership behavior, because that agentic leadership is perceived as less desirable in women than men. So you're essentially not as feminine, you're not conforming to that gender role, and thus it's a less favorable evaluation of you and your leadership abilities and behavior. So this results in a double bind, or what Ibarra and Petrigliari discussed as their impossible selves, because the maintenance of women's gender role may result in a failure to meet the requirements of a leader role, whereas conforming to a leader role may result in a failure to conform to the gender role. So you're stuck. You're just stuck. You can't be one and the same person. Some of this may reflect bias, and thankfully first-generation bias has largely been legislated out, but it's still we can see aspects of it, particularly second-generation bias. Second-generation bias is more subtle than first-generation bias and stems from cultural assumptions and organizational structures, practices, and patterns of interaction that inadvertently benefit men while putting women at a disadvantage. And I want to emphasize this. I don't think it's often the case that men are intentionally trying to disadvantage women. These are these inadvertent things, these assumptions, implicit biases that we all hold, and they exist though. And it does present limiting. It does limit women in leadership. Ibarra, Eli, and Kolb discussed this quite a bit in terms of second-generation bias and focused on a number of different areas. One is there's a relative paucity of women in leadership roles. And I looked at this picture here, and you're looking at a group of people in a discussion, right? A leadership discussion. There's only one woman. And you can kind of see that it doesn't look like she's somebody I necessarily want to be, because it doesn't look like a very pleasant situation for her. And these images, I think, make it difficult for young women to aspire. We learn by looking at role models. And the paucity of women leaders, they argue, may send the incorrect message that being a woman is a liability in leadership, and consequently discourage younger women from seeking the advice of women leaders or pursuing their own leadership path. In addition, Ibarra and colleagues emphasize and discuss the negative impact of gendered career paths and gendered work. Many organizations and work patterns stem from a time when men worked and women managed the home and household responsibilities. And we see this in academic medicine all the time. There's this space-time culture where you have to be present, you have to be seen. I don't know about your institutions, but at mine, most meetings start at 7, some at 6:30 in the morning, and or after work at 5 or 5:30, with this expectation that you show up and you're there, which makes it very, very difficult if you've got home responsibilities or if you want a life. In addition, often national and international transfers are of assuming leadership roles, particularly within the business sector, and they often assume a trailing spouse so that you don't have to worry about juggling a 2-career family. Finally, the behind-the-scenes work, or that organizational citizenship behavior work, is assumed by women and not valued. This fosters the perception that men are best suited to lead and women are better suited to work behind the scenes. They also discuss the fact that women lack access to networks and sponsors. And this is something that's been written about quite a bit. And I know Sylviane Hewlett's written on this, as well as a number of others. Networks are critical for aspiring leaders, yet women typically have smaller networks. This is because we have a tendency to want to spend time with people who look like us. And there are differences in women's and men's organizational roles, career prospects, and other life demands that make it difficult to do that networking at times. In terms of sponsors, once again, the volume of TCN that I cited from 2018 has a paper looking at sponsorship, but sponsors are different than mentors, and that sponsors are leaders who put their political capital into play to support or promote an individual. It's kind of making a bet on somebody and kind of putting your integrity, your name out there for somebody. Once again, people tend to prefer to associate with others who look like them, which makes it difficult to identify sponsors. Most sponsors are those in existing leadership roles, i.e. men, usually white older men. And Hewlett's research highlights that both older men and younger women are worried about misperceptions of sexual impropriety, which constrains potential male leaders' desire to sponsor women and limits young women's initiative in seeking out sponsors. And since the #MeToo movement, this is even more problematic. In fact, I had a colleague here at the clinic who works in the executive suite, and she said that shortly after the Weinstein debacle and all the other things that came out, former male colleagues stopped literally walking into her office. They would kind of literally straddle the open door because they were afraid of walking into her office, which you can see is going to limit your ability to be most effective. It limits your network. It makes it more difficult to move forward in an organization. What about bias in the sciences? The sciences are presumably data-driven. It's stark. We know what's going on. Are there biases in the sciences? And we do know that there are. Moss Rakusin wrote a very influential paper, and this is with Joe Handelsman, who's at the NIH now, in which they did a randomized double-blind design. They looked at 127 men and women faculty at research-intensive universities, and they had them review applications for a student interested in a lab management position. The applications were identical except for gender. Both men and women participants rated the male applicant as more qualified than the identical woman. Participants were more likely to offer the male applicant a higher starting salary and provide career mentoring. So I want to emphasize this is both men and women, so women cannot point the finger here. We hold these implicit biases as well. What about the National Institute of Health? The NIH has been working quite strongly in terms of remedying gender bias, and I think has done a laudable work in this area. But there's still some problems that we see, and these are based on data a little bit later, not more recent data. There I am for being articulate. Anyhow, so these are old data. So what happened is Katz, and I think this is out of Molly Carn's lab, yes it is, did a text analysis of NIH R01 grant critiques and looked at the role of gender of the PI. There were no gender differences for initial submissions. So men and women are putting out initial submissions just as much as always, and the grant critiques and the scores are roughly identical. However, significant gender differences were evident for R01 renewals, with women PIs receiving significantly lower priority scores, despite significantly more adjectives indicating outstanding and excellence in their work and more positive references to their ability. So they're giving all these laudatory, qualitative data in terms of you're doing excellent work, outstanding, and so on, but the scores, which are what really matter, are lower, significantly lower than men. What about looking at the intersectionality between gender and race? And there are not an awful lot of data out there, and this is one of the few studies I was able to find. Ginther looked at NIH grants management database from 2000 to 2006. So once again, remember, these data are old relative to some of the initiatives the NIH has been doing to investigate gender differences and race ethnicity specific gender differences in the probability of receiving an R01. Both white men and white women were equally likely to get an R01 funded. Asian and Black women were significantly less likely than white women to get funding. And overall, women submitted fewer grant applications. In fact, Blacks and women who were new investigators were more likely to submit only one application from 2000 to 2006 than multiple applications. And so I think that's something that we can change. If you want to get NIH funding, and I think this is a lesson beyond NIH funding, if you want to succeed, you have to get up to bat. You have to submit a grant. You're not going to get a grant if you don't apply. How about in surgery? This is a really interesting study, and this was presented online. I read about this. So Sarsens examined Medicare data on physicians' referrals to a surgeon and looked at male versus female surgeons and good versus bad outcome. If the patient, so you're referring your primary care doc, you're referring your patient to see a surgeon, if there's a good patient outcome, it benefited male surgeons significantly more than the women surgeons. If there was a bad outcome, like death or some sort of a irreversible side effect or something, what happened, it disproportionately impacted future referrals to women surgeons versus men, much less likely to refer to that woman surgeon. The surgeon's gender drove the referrals, and one negative experience with a woman surgeon impacted referrals to all women surgeons. So essentially, we're judged based by one example. How about bias in those women who have reportedly made it, who are full professors? Pinkleton did a qualitative study of women full professors at a Midwestern medical school. And she looked at kind of the qualitative data in terms of how women's experiences being a professor. And the participants described significant challenges, such as being treated with silent bias, being ignored, or treated as an other, Coping strategies that they tended to utilize included downplaying those, maintaining a distance, humor, which I know is something that I use often myself, and careful use of the white coat. I think the white coat is an equalizer, and I know that most important meetings that I have, I wear my white coat, and I think very carefully about how I sit, how I stand, what I say, how I say it, and so on. Other factors associated with success included raw intelligence, working in a meritocracy, even-tempered nature, and this concept of carefully constructed femininity, which we'll talk about in just a minute, sponsorship and institutional support for diversity in childcare. This idea of carefully constructed femininity is a concept that we actually hosted a large conference in Cleveland for women in STEM to increase women leaders in STEM, and really gets at this kind of core idea of the double bind and this impossible selves, where you're in a leadership role as maybe a professor, but you have to have this carefully constructed femininity where you're making sure that you're not too much of an agentic leader or too harsh or dictatorial or whatever, while you've got this feminine side of yourself, and it's kind of a tightrope that you need to walk. What about the cost of ambition to personal life? And this I thought was really fascinating, is that there are data out there that men still prefer women partners who are less professionally ambitious than they are. And a recent set of studies reviewed in the Harvard Business Review suggested that single women in MBA programs avoided publicly endorsing actions that would help their careers, presumably due to marriage considerations. So essentially, they were doing like these surveys, and that you're in a class and you've got some single women, some single men, and you've got men who are partnered, women who are partnered, and they're comparing all of these groups. And the question is, how willing would you be to travel? How many hours do you want to work a week? So what happened is it was all groups were equal except for the single women who said, oh, I don't want to travel so much, or oh, I don't want to work so hard. Partly out of it that they may not be as attractive or potentially as attractive as a potential spouse, okay? But when the responses were anonymous, and it wasn't that public forum where there were potentially single men who might be marriage partners at some point, single women were just as ambitious as partnered women and men. So we modify our responses depending on the context and our partner status. So all of these things mean that women in academic medicine, or women in general who aspire to leadership positions, are walking a tightrope. You got these social role expectations in terms of gender expectations, coupled with how they're discordant from leadership expectations. As it's related to gender role expectations, you've got the cost associated with increasing organizational citizenship behavior, where you're supposed to give and give and give and give while still trying to push your own career forward. You've got biases regarding women's ability that we all hold, men and women. And as I said, I don't think that these are necessarily known and intentionally acted on, but they are there. There are these implicit biases. You have organizational expectations. I work at the Cleveland Clinic. It's a very hierarchical, male-dominated institution where leadership has always been a white male surgeon. So what's the problem? And as Ibera, Eli, and Kolb stated, it is challenging for women to establish credibility in a culture that is deeply conflicted about whether, when, and how they should exercise authority. This is another interesting study that I really liked. This is looking at values. And Gino, Wilmuth, and Brooks, I think this was in PNAS, examined if men and women view professional development differently and if those views affect decisions to pursue leadership positions. They conducted a series of experiments with over 4,000 participants from diverse populations, and they discovered that women had significantly more life goals than men did. Women had significantly fewer life goals related to achieving power at work than men did. And women associated more negative outcomes with high-level positions, such as longer hours, stress, trade-offs, while still recognizing the benefits. And that women pursued professional advancement opportunities significantly less than men did. So I think the key is that women, they also found women viewed high-level positions as equally attainable. It wasn't an issue that women didn't feel as if they could attain and succeed in the job, but they just did not find it desirable, which once again speaks more to cultural issues than women's desire and achievement and initiative in pursuing leadership. So let's shift now and talk a little bit about what do we do. This is kind of the background, and I thought it would have been better at this point in my career at least, but it isn't. So how do we start to encourage more women and diverse people to become leaders? And I think the first thing you need to do is you internalize a leadership identity by developing a sense of purpose. And this is a theme that comes out repeatedly. Prior to developing that purpose, I think you really, really need to know your values and your strengths. In other words, what's your sweet spot? What are those things that you do better than anybody else? And in Mary Oliver's beautiful poem, I think it's A Summer Day, tell me, what is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? This is an exercise that I've done in terms of faculty development, shared with many, many people. It's been very profoundly influential for some individuals as they've shared with me afterwards. It's pretty simple. You sit and you draw a series of 3 concentric circles. In the bullseye are those things that are most important and critical to you. Mine includes my family, signified by my children's initials. That's the most important thing to me. And then on the middle circle, those things that are important, but not as critically important. And on the periphery, those things that are not as important, that are the least important. But you can't cram everything into that bullseye. There's no way you can write, no matter how small you write, and put everything in that center circle. So that means you have to make some sort of a decision. Now, I love academic medicine. Okay, I love seeing my patients, I love writing, and I love teaching. But when push comes to shove, I love writing more than I love teaching. So that means that if I have an opportunity to teach, and it's something I'm really excited about, I have to recognize that means I'm going to have less time to write. And am I willing to make that sacrifice? Similarly, when I thought really hard about it, first I thought I wanted a title, and I thought, no, I don't want a title. I want to be able to influence the culture and change things. That doesn't mean I have to have a title. So the title goes out here, so I'm not taking my energy in pursuing a title, but I'm putting a lot of energy in investing things in terms of influencing the culture and making things better for other people. And you can do the same thing similarly with yourself. This seems like it would be an easy task, but it truly, truly isn't. And it takes time and self-reflection and kind of honesty and courage in terms of figuring out what are your values. There are no right or wrong answers, but if you have clarity regarding your values, it's much easier to follow through on what you want to do because you're going to know what you want to do. In terms of your strengths, I've used the Strengths Finder and recommended this to quite a bit of people as well. It's based on tens of thousands of data using the Gallup data. In terms of identifying what are your specific strengths, they break it into these big buckets. And the whole idea behind the Strengths Finders is you capitalize on your strengths and you build a team to help maybe with your relative weaknesses. Push comes to shove, I can be very, very organized. I can, dot every I, cross every T, but that's not what I love to do. My strength is really more big visionary kinds of things. So I make sure that I've got people on my team that can take care of that so I can put my energy there to really shine in something that I may be particularly good at, and so that I'm not just kind of mediocre across the board, okay? These are some of the big, broad categories. It's relatively easy. You get the book, you complete this scale online, that you get your scores, and you can read up on it. But it's highly, highly effective, and it's been used widely in the literature and in business, and has significant reliability and validity. Equally important to knowing your strengths, you have to know what pushes your buttons. And this is related to that concept of emotional intelligence, which has been wholeheartedly adopted in the business world and also makes sense when we think about social neuroscience and social cognitive science. And you have to know what pushes your buttons, and that kind of insight and self-knowledge is critical to a developing leader. And to be able to recognize the heart rate's going up, I'm not feeling very happy, something's going on, what's driving this, and then to take a step back to try and control those emotions so that you can move forward in an effective way. This is probably the most important task for developing leaders. And Twain articulated this beautifully more than 100 years ago, I guess now. The two most important days in your life are the day you were born and the day you find out why. Craig and Snook in Harvard Business Review paper from 2014 detail this and provide a nice explanation of how do you create a statement of purpose to impact. And they argue that this leads to exceptional performance in the business realm, greater well-being and health benefits, yet few leaders can do this, kind of articulate a strong sense of individual purpose and distill that into a concrete statement. And they argue that they believe that the process of articulating your purpose and finding the courage to live it, or what they call purpose to impact, is the single most important developmental task you can undertake as a leader. This has also been, this whole idea has been reflected as well in Jim Collins' research as well. So let's go back to this creating a statement of purpose to impact, because this is kind of vague, and I would refer you to the original article, and I can certainly send it, a PDF to you if you'd like. But what you want to do, what Craig and Snook argue, is that you go back and you kind of comb through your life story and identify those periods in which you felt like you were in flow, like that positive psychology sense of flow with, I'm not going to try and say his name because I can never say it correctly. What are the commonalities there? What was going on that made you feel like, oh, this is exactly what I want to do, where time kind of stands still, where you're lost in the whole process. So you comb through and identify what are the commonalities there, and then you distill it into a statement that includes verbs and action words that actually make you want to go out and do this. And it's something that's kind of like your mark, your brand. Okay, you share that statement with friends and family, people who know you and love you, and distill it until it gets really tight and compact. And it's something that's like a rallying cry for you. You know, I can tell you that for mine is that my statement is that I make connections to help people flourish. I can't do that with everybody, but what it does, it reflects on the fact that I'm highly curious. And so I read all kinds of different literature, and then I make connections together that may not be obvious. And the reason I make those connections is to help make the world a better place, to help people flourish. So I can't do it in all domains and all capacities or everything because there's only me. So I focus my work, as I said at the beginning, on faculty development to help build other people up so they can flourish. And then in my research, which combines the humanities, i.e. ethics and narrative and story, with neuroscience to help patients and clinical teams do a better job. But it's an incredibly important process. And once you have that clarity of vision regarding your values, your strengths, and why you were put here, opportunities arise that you never would have seen without having that kind of a framework and a sense of vision. Once you have that, you have to own your power. And Gloria Feld has written on this quite nicely, and she's actually got a whole curriculum as well. And one way in which you do that is you kind of wear the shirt. And once you make that commitment to something that you believe in and that you're going to do with your one wild and precious life, it's a very potent, powerful tool, because it essentially gives you the courage to go out and do things because it's not for you, right? It's not, my purpose statement is I want to be, world leader. No. The purpose is because if I want to help other people, then that means it's not about me, it's about others. And it gives you that courage to go stand in and own your power. And then also that credibility so that other people see that this is who you are. This is your actions align with your values. And that integrity is key in terms of developing social capital, which will allow you to make more and more of these bold statements. Equally important to knowing yourself is you have to know the organization, and you can insert your own organization's values and culture. This is simply the Cleveland Clinic. We firmly believe that patients first. This is an organization that is committed to delivering the best patient care possible. This is also an organization that's very surgery driven. As I said, we thrive on innovation. and education is key. And so knowing that culture, does this fit with the culture? How does it not fit? How do I make my purpose statement, purpose to impact statement, align with the organization's? And this applies to any organization. So how do you become a leader? The only way you become a leader is to get out there and start doing it. And it means you have to flex those leadership muscles. And I firmly believe, as I have already alluded to, that leadership is influence. It is not a title or a position. Leadership development is an iterative process that involves purposeful action. Those actions may be affirmed or resisted, and others' responses to those purposeful actions will increase or decrease the likelihood of similar actions. It's simple behavior. And an individual's sense of herself as a leader is shaped by those interactions. So you want to choose wisely in terms of what do you do, where do you start to exert and stretch those leadership muscles, but not be so constrained that you're not going out for things that you can do. So over time, as your sense of the self as a leader grows, the opportunities to develop leadership expand exponentially with more challenging tasks, leading to even more positive feedback from the organization and those in power, so that you can start to move forward and to stretch and experiment with other growth opportunities for exercise and leadership. And once again, leadership does not necessarily have to be a title. It has to be influencing and figuring out how are you going to do that in a way that feeds into your statement and your purpose to impact statement. Conversely, if the actions are not rewarded, the developing leader is less likely to seek out leadership growth opportunities, which leads to fewer opportunities to be viewed as a leader, and over time diminishes a sense of self as a leader. Remember those R01 data, that women were much less likely to submit a second grant. And I think that you don't get funding, you don't get leadership opportunities if you don't get up to bat. So we start to put all of this together. I think that first and foremost, identify how your values and strengths align with the organization's values and goals. You have to identify what pushes your buttons and have really good insight into that so that you can control those emotions, so you're not getting kind of your limbic lobe isn't hijacking, your amygdala is not hijacking your brain. You know, develop a diverse network. And this is critically important, I think, particularly for women. And outside of neuropsychology, within neuropsychology, outside of your work setting, within your work setting, and all different levels of individuals. You develop a diverse network and you establish social capital. Social capital is essentially based on the norms of trust and reciprocity. And you develop trust by acting with integrity, where people know what you stand for, where you deliver when you're supposed to deliver, and that there's this sense of responsibility and you help others. You figure out how to align your values and your goals so that they're shared to help others. You identify opportunities, or you make opportunities to flex leadership muscles inside and outside the organization. I encourage you to think outside of the box. It could be writing a paper. It could be chairing a task force. It could be volunteering in your community. There are myriad ways in which to flex those leadership muscles, to learn how to do, to develop those skills so that if an opportunity comes up, that you're prepared. But there are many different ways in the community that in professional and non-professional venues. I think effective leaders are very strategic and think of both the immediate and long-term returns in the context of where they are in their career development. So this doesn't mean that you only choose those assignments or responsibilities that are going to help benefit your career in the short term or the long term, because I think the other thing, this gets to kind of that credibility and trust and reciprocity. As one of my colleagues and friends said, you know, every work setting and every team has this huge pile of manure, although that's not the word she used, right? And everybody's expected to help shovel some of it now and then. So you don't want to kind of dump on your colleagues and have them do all of the kind of crap work so that you shine. It has to be more equitably distributed. But you want to be strategic in terms of thinking about where you are, which harkens back a little bit to when we were looking at the data regarding women and men in leadership and their roles in organizations within neuropsychology. You'll remember maybe that the only role in which women outnumbered men other than staff was training director. Training director is a tremendous amount of work. It's an incredibly important job. There's no denying that. But it's also something that more often than not does not give you the quick bumps. It's not as valued, to be frank, as like papers or grants and so on. And if you're investing a lot of time in training director, you kind of know that, but it's not generally as valued by the institution in terms of standard metrics. That may be changing. I know I sit on the promotions committee, and I'm chairing the promotions committee this year of the School of Medicine at Case. And we are working very hard to make sure that all forms and all contributions to academic medicine are valued and viewed to be important. But it's not often that you get your news about being the training director is put in the newspaper, whereas if you get a grant, it could very well be. So I think that's something that we need to think a little bit about, is it because training director is more often associated with nurturing and kindness and mentoring, or I don't know, but it's something that I think it's worth considering. In addition, effective leaders, as well as being strategic and thinking both immediate and long-term returns in the context of where they are in their career development, are very, very, very well prepared. This is something that has been emphasized repeatedly by one of the senior women staff here at the clinic. Very, very well prepared, particularly for women. She said too, I think women talk too much. I'm guilty as charged of that. And so if I'm very well prepared, I'm less likely to stray off of what I think I need to say. I'm much more concise and succinct, and I don't repeat myself. And effective leaders also blend agency with communal attributes. So it's that carefully constructed femininity construct. And as Egli and Carly stated, combine exceptional competence, not just competence, exceptional competence with warmth and friendliness to build social capital on the job. Okay, for some reason, all this just doesn't seem like enough. I've been talking about this for a long time, and it just keeps bouncing off into space because people's beliefs. So I think the thing that we need to do now in terms of really moving the needle by taking action is we need to share data, like I've shared with you today. We need to partner with men and other people, other women, to develop allies so that we're all understanding these implicit biases. We need to advocate for best practices. I know that many search committees now insist that before you engage in the work for the search committee that you take the Harvard implicit bias test. So it makes you see where you're at. And they're also requiring here behavioral data. What are the sources of the data in terms of you're evaluating this potential staff applicant? Did you go to their talk? Did you go out to dinner with them? Did you interview with them separately? And give specific behavioral indicators of why you're choosing to rank them in this way. I think you have to exercise and expand your influence. It's like anything. If you want to run and you want to get better at running, you have to get on the treadmill or you have to put on your tennis shoes and you have to run. That's the only way you're going to get better at it. And I think you take advantage of the many resources that are available. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of Women in Neuropsychology subgroup, our committee within Division 40 of the American Psychological Association. And over that time frame, we've seen an increase in the number of women in leadership positions. So take advantage of the WIN listserv. I believe there's one through NAN as well. Take advantage of mentoring and sponsorship initiatives at your local institution as well as at other national conferences and so on. And look at formal leadership programs like ELAM, the Harvard program, or the Leadership Institute for Women in Psychology through the American Psychological Association. There are opportunities and ways out there to really develop and hone these skills and to try things on in a relatively safe environment as you develop those skills. Bottom line, though, we need more diversity in leadership, which means, once again, we need more diverse people leading and influencing and applying for leadership positions. And the thought, well, next final thought I'll leave you with, is we need to start looking at the real person and gently push back against expectations. And also just to remember, and quoting Elizabeth Blackwell, it's not easy to be a pioneer, but oh, it is fascinating. I'm going to trade one moment, even the worst moment, for all the riches in the world. And so with that, I'll open it up to questions, but this has to be one of my favorite slides ever. All right, thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Dr. Kubu, Kubu, do you see any questions on your chat bar?
I am looking at the comments. Let me see, comments. That's my slides. I don't see any.
Okay.
There aren't any in the chat board.
Okay, thank you. Pushback, questions, anything like that?
Well, I just want to say thank you for a very interesting, though frustrating presentation. I think it's important to continue talking about some of these things and pushing our leaders as much as possible to be more mindful about their own bias, in particular that implicit bias. I know nobody actually wants to hear that they have a bias themselves, and so I think that's part of the challenge, is getting somebody to buy into the fact that you have bias too, and it's impacting your ability to get the best and the brightest within your own organization and to promote those people into their full potential. And I think that's the spot where I feel stuck personally.
I think that that's excellent. I'll tell you, one of the reviewers for the paper that I wrote for TCN mentioned something that I think is very helpful, and in terms of framing it in terms of white privilege, so it's not bias, and that may be more palatable. The other thing too is to emphasize that these are implicit biases that we all hold, right? Mm-hmm. And how do we kind of break out of those? I know what's been effective for me is to cite data. And like I got a small grant to increase diversity in upper academic faculty rank within our medical school. And I said, look, these are the data. This is not, the data do not reflect the purported values of this institution. So let's figure out what we're going to do. And so got some funding to literally increase the number of women and minorities applying for associate and full professor. So I think data help. I think language and how we frame things help. And also, I think it's really critical to align values, okay? Because then it's not adversarial. If it's adversarial, it's not going to be as effective. And to go in and assume, okay, well, I know that we all share this goal of increased diversity. We know that there's higher return on investment with more diverse leadership. Leadership reflects the community we serve as well as our faculty's demographics. Help me figure out how we're going to do this. Here's an idea. You see what I mean? So if you partner and try and align those things in terms of presumed shared values or explicit shared values, I think that that's one way to do it. But it's not easy, but it's incredibly important.
It doesn't look like we have any more comments in the chat box, but I just wanted to take a minute to thank Dr. Kubu for her wonderful talk today. I think that we are starting to realize more and more that while we have these issues, it's good to, as you said, take a positive look, partner, work in collaboration with others that are in the same situation to try to have some influence and make some changes that can be of benefit to women in all stages of their career. So thank you very much for closing off our session of Women in Academic Medicine. Thank you to the Houston Neuropsychological Society for sponsoring this talk for CEs. If you will complete your evaluation of the talk today, the evaluation form will go out early next week. Then we can send out certificates for your CE records. And again, thank you, Dr. Kubu, for the talk. And if you would send me that article,
Yep.
I could post it along with a PDF of your slides, and then I will let the group know when the video is ready for viewing.
Not a problem. And I would just encourage everybody to act. We've been talking a long time. We need to act. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We will send out information on the talk for next month. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll be in touch. Bye-bye.